Hi everyone, Alan Dawson from Business Depot Agency Broking. Great to be back in front of you. Very much talking about rent roll sales and agency sales and the complexities around some of the points behind those transactions. Importantly, a solicitor's role within this is paramount, and I've got with me today an absolute expert within that role, Robert Shepley, the Director of Business Depot Legal.
Thanks, Alan.
We're going to talk about a couple of things that maybe that would be important to you when you're going through the transaction. And I think, Rob, if I could ask you the question first of all, what do you see as the key role that a solicitor has within that complex transaction?
Al, there's a few elements to it. A big part of it is around actually managing the whole transaction. So there's a big element before you even get to signing a contract. So part of that is around, you might have, if you're a seller, you might have found a buyer, you might have agreed on some terms, but there's a lot of finer detail to be negotiated. So we step in and advise people on what needs to be there and how to make sure that that is set up to suit your circumstances or buying or selling. So there's that element, and then once it gets signed, then there's the whole process around managing conditions and around, with these transactions, it is a business transaction, so it's not like a property conveyance where you can sort of, all the advisors do everything. It's something where all the parties need to be actively involved, but they need to be guided, and that's sort of where we come in.
Yeah, because there's changing parts within the transaction along the pathway, so it's being adaptable as well, I guess, is important.
That's right, and look, invariably problems will come up. When a buyer's doing due diligence, they'll find things, and then it's just being able to deal with those issues in a way that progresses the transaction.
Yeah, absolutely. And within that transaction, other than finance, which is a typical one where things can go a little bit pear-shaped, other than that, where do you see things going wrong within the transaction? Where are the roadblocks for the thing actually going in?
Due diligence is always a big one. So often what it is you'll find that a buyer will be doing their due diligence and then they'll find a handful of issues, which often there'll be issues that the seller wasn't even aware of. And it's around making sure that we can deal with the issues in a way that leads to a resolution. So it's quite important to manage that properly so that it's sort of seen as, here's a problem, identified it, let's work out how we fix it.
Absolutely.
Rather than a sort of I found a problem, I want to get out. So it sort of needs to be managed to make sure that people are going through the right process.
And in some ways, I've mentioned this in the past in a couple of recordings that we've had, is that sometimes because we're agents dealing with agents and all of that, but sometimes we've got to respectfully park our egos at the door. And that is that if a problem comes up, move ahead, get some great advice, solve that problem, move on, try to make the transaction happen, because that's really why you went into it in the first place. So work towards that, I think is really important. And the second thing probably, Rob, that if I could throw in just in finalising this recording, is that the buyer and the seller need to take a certain amount of control within that transaction. Don't sort of think, well, I've gone to contract, we'll let the solicitors sort it out. They need to be engaged, working with the broker, the other parties and so on, to come up with resolutions along the way and make it happen. So
that's right, Al. And one thing that's because obviously we're dealing with real estate agents, so they are used to dealing with property conveyances and transactions, so they see how that works. So I suppose the big part to emphasise is that in some ways it might be a little bit similar to a property transaction, but it's a lot more complex, and it does need that active involvement. So sometimes there's a little bit of a education piece on I suppose how these things work and the common things that people need to be involved with.
Absolutely. Well, listen, I hope that certainly helps. It's a bit of a snapshot, a sort of view into the role of the solicitor within that transaction. If you do need any support or advice from myself in relation to buying, selling, rent rolls, real estate agencies, my details will be included. If you do need an expert within the solicitor side of the transaction and some great advice, Robert Shepley, Director of Business Depot Legal, will be able to support you on that. His details are provided as well, and we look forward to seeing you possibly on our next recording.